Hello, my name is Eric Normand, and I'm doing a code review for a contest that Lambda Up is having, and I'm reviewing a text editor, an Emacs-like text editor written in Clojure. And I have to say that, and this is the person who did it. I'm probably going to butcher this name, so I'm just going to let you read it there. I have to say that this code base is very nice. It's just been a pleasure to read, and it's bigger than I expected it to be. Meaning, I didn't think it would be so complete. I thought someone would have something to review that was like a small pet project, and there's been a lot of work put into it. It's very clean code. It looks really nice. So I asked the creator what part of it, because it's so big, I asked him what part of it he would like me to review. And he said that he wanted the slider to be done first. And so that's where I started. And slider is actually a cool namespace where the core data structure is defined. And it was just really cool to see like how I've never built a text editor, so to see how a text editor would be built, like what you would build it on as your core abstraction. Okay, so just on the surface, it looks really good. It's well formatted. There's doc strings for everything. The code, the functions are short and concise. All that is really nice. So all that said, I'm going to start picking things apart that I've noticed that are kind of two things that are kind of nitpicking, like, oh, try this, like I think it would be better, and also directions to explore. So I don't know how much the creator has explored on this abstraction, but there's some things that I noticed. So let's just dive in. Okay, the first thing I want to point out is this left function and the associated right function. This was the first function that made me stop and have to really read carefully what was going on, because it's got an if statement and then a cond with 3 branches. And it wasn't clear to me why it had to be so many different cases. I know that the new line has to be treated specially, because when you do left, you actually want to move, to the other line. But I couldn't figure out why this single, when amount is 1, is special. It looks like you should be able to just use 1 in your how do you call it? In just as the amount is 1. So for instance, when the amount is not 1, you just do this drop n. So n is the amount. Why not do that? So there could be a real reason, right? I don't know. But this one, this one kind of stuck out at me. And so it made me also think, is doing left one time different from doing, so calling this function left with amount 1, is it different from, sorry, let me say it again. If I do left with the amount 2, is that different from doing left with the amount 1 and then left with amount 1 again? Right? Is that different? Should it be different? And that's the question I have here. And maybe they are, but it's not clear to me when I think about editing text and moving with the arrow keys that would be the case, even on that new line case. Say I'm at the beginning of the line. Yeah, I just can't picture it. Okay, so that's something that I would either clarify or simplify this code, because I just imagine that this code is really important. Maybe you need to clarify with a comment or something, like why you're checking for this amount 1. And the same goes for write. And so if I were going to, I'm not an expert at text editing and writing text editors, but if I were to recommend something, it would be exploring whether you could have a single function that moved left 1, and then a function that moved left 2 would just do the first one twice. Or the opposite, where you just have the single case of always having an amount, could be 0 or more, and it would just work in the single case. Right. So I would explore that, because having two conditionals, one with 3 branches, is kind of odd. Right. Okay. So another thing that's a little troubling when I see it is this use of nil on the character to see if the list that the after list is empty, and the same up here in the left. Where is it? Where you do the nil to see if the before list is empty. That to me seems like a legitimate first case that would go up here. Like if I'm at the beginning of the buffer, just return it, right? If I'm hitting left, I'm at the beginning, don't do anything. That to me is like a base case, right? And then you might want to use, instead of looking at, looking at if it's nil, use one of the sort of higher abstraction functions you've already created. I think there is a function in here. Yeah, beginning or end. You should use those because their higher abstraction is going to be easier to understand. The name is good, so use those a little more often. And then there's a general thing I want to talk about, which is, what are the core operations that everything else can be defined in terms of? They could be in here, like all the ones where you're doing actual calculations and direct manipulation of stuff. Those might be your core, but it's not clear in the layout of it that, hey, look, everything's built on these 5 operations. Because you see a lot of them are built on some, right? Like some of them, like, let me find one. Right, like point to mark. It's just defined in stuff you've defined up above. It's very simple. These are all the mark ones. Well, I don't see any more now, of course, while I'm ad-libbing this. Anyway, I think that there would be a lot of benefit to trying to reduce down the number of abstractions, the number of functions that you have on defined directly in terms of, getting and setting the fields from the SL map. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, so many of these operations they know about the structure of it. And to really clarify that there's only a few things you can do. You can, and maybe even separate them out. There are things about moving the point left and right. There are things about left and right, beginning, end, whatever operations you have there. And don't worry about efficiency, right? Because you can make it more efficient later. There are things about inserting and deleting, right? Those are about the text. And of course, the point has to move appropriately and all of that. And the marks have to move. And then there's things about moving the marks or setting marks, getting marks, those kinds of things. But it seems to me that they should be the ones that actually have to reference the internal structure of this map could be far fewer. And I would consider looking at that. All right, one more thing that I thought was really interesting was this insert function. It takes a slider and some text, and the text is a string, and it puts that text, at the point, and it makes the point at the end of that text. And so this is one of those areas where I would really explore whether text could be another slider. So instead of operating where you've got a slider and you're putting text in, you've got two sliders and you're combining them together. This kind of operation, this binary operation, is where you start to get into, I'm going to use the term monoids. It's where you start to have these binary operations where you take two things that are the same type and you return a thing of that same type. And you can have really interesting operations that are very clear and easy to write. For instance, when you have this text here, you have to do a count and a line count. But notice that's already duplicated. It's already done for you in the create, right? So you could have a thing that just pulls out the total lines and the count. I don't think the count is in there now that I look at it. Anyway, you could, if you made it like take a slider with a point and insert another slider, throw away the inner slider, the one you're adding, throw away all of its marks because it probably won't have any. Throw away its point, but use the before and after things to put onto the before, move the point, and do all that. But instead of operating on a string, you're operating on two sliders. And then that gives you other stuff like, well, I want to append two sliders, right? That's obviously a monoid operation. I don't know what else you could do with text like that, but appending and appending the other way. And then you could have an empty slider, a slider with no text in it. And that would let you, do interesting things like reduce over a list of sliders. It was something to explore. It's a functional direction to move in. Okay, so also there's a lot of places in here where you like filter out nils and things, and I'm wondering why there are nils in these lists of tokens, and whether you shouldn't filter them out immediately when you do a create or an insert, instead of when you're like counting the number of lines in a thing, or how many lines you need to move. And I'm trying to find a thing where you filter out nils, because that was a little disturbing. Okay, another thing. This right until, left until. Very nice. But I'm wondering if the regex is the wrong level of abstraction. That maybe you want a predicate here, so a function that will take a character or a token and return true or false. You can always put in a regex that does that. And you can even make a little helper function that will take a regex and return a function that does this rematches. But I would make that a function. and see how you're doing the right one a lot and left one. That really made me think that this one operation might be the basis of something. Because if you're willing to go through, it's a little bit less efficient to do one at a time, because you have to make a new map and a new map and a new map each time. But if you're willing to do it here, maybe it's not that inefficient, and maybe it should just be, move right one is the operation. And you could even, just like you do here, you could make end, move to end or move to beginning. You could make move to end, move right one until it's the end. And so it's a simple loop. It's just something to consider, because it might really compress your code and make everything clearer. I really love finding those really neat, tidy, easy to reason about abstractions, like that are based on a few simple operations, especially if they're like monoids and stuff. Oh, by the way, I should say, in case you don't know, a monoid is an operation that is associative and has an identity. The identity of a slider is clear, that it's just a slider with no text. And then the operations have to be binary, so they take two sliders and return a slider. There's some combining operation. And insert could be it. Okay, so those are the things I saw. But like I said, this is really clean code. I rarely see code so well maintained, in the sense of like it's groomed, everything's nice and orderly, everything has a doc string. The doc strings were really clear about what was going on, and in general the code is very readable. Yeah, cool. So I'm going to go on to renderer. Okay, this code is a lot harder to read. I know this is like GUI code basically, but it's just doing a lot of stuff. It's not the kind of thing that lends itself well to being very functional. It's just like calculate 20 things and then combine them in some specific way. Like, I don't know how much I can do about that. But I can tell you stylistically, there are some things that pop out at me. The first one here is insert token. I think this is in the wrong namespace. It seems like it should be in slider. I don't know why insert token isn't just calling insert, which takes text, and it seems to do the same operation. The other thing that bothers me about it is that you have to reference this namespace, these keywords. And so now this namespace knows about the internal structure of that map, and that's a big point of coupling. So anytime you want to change the structure, you want to, I need a new value. I need to add something under this key. So I'm going to take what used to be a simple key value and now turn it into a key with a map with two key values itself. And now all your code that's referencing these things is now broken. And again, I don't even know why this one would exist, because it seems like it's taken care of with insert by itself. Maybe I'm wrong, but it seems like it should be. And then if it does need to stay, I would try to define it in terms of something that is a function defined in here. And one of the ones that's like core operations or built on core operations that you're saying this is stable enough that we can use it from outside. And so then it happens here too with the windows, where you are getting the window, the information about the windows. You're getting it out, and I haven't gone into the window namespace and seen what all this stuff is, but I would guess that these would better be abstracted as a function. So something that's like, this is public, it's safe, you can do it. So for instance, the name of the window could be in the window namespace, window/name, right? And it's a function that all it does right now is looks up this key in the map. But right now, what this is saying is that this code here is saying, I know window is a map. I know it has this key, or it should. And you know the type because you're going to use it somewhere else. And so you're assuming that it's not going to change. Those are the reason we have these namespaces is to shield us from those kinds of assumptions. That you want to have a small number of assumptions that you have to make about the namespace. And in my experience, keys in a map are not that stable. You want something like a function that you can declare, this is always going to return the name. It's always going to be a string. And if we ever move the structure, or move the name within the map or change that it's a map, that will hide that from you as the consumer of this function. So I would look at doing stuff like that. I know I think you're the only contributor to this, so it probably doesn't seem like that big a deal, but over time, those are the things that add up to slowing down development of new features and things. And like I said before, these functions are kind of big. I can't really understand exactly what they're doing, because a lot of them are not really expressed in terms of like editor operations that I can imagine. It's things like add br. What is that? Add br. Forward line. You're doing some math here. S0 left get char, and then yeah. It's too much for me to keep in my head without really living in this code base. So I don't know what I would do when I have a function like this where I'm just like, I have no idea how to make it better. I just start pulling little things out and naming them, because names, they let you forget the actual implementation and just look at sort of what they do. So I would maybe name that, and then name that, and name that. And before you know it, you've pulled out enough names where you can kind of get a handle on what's going on. Right. So here's another thing. This is a pattern that you use a lot. You use this nth, iterate, then some function, and you're operating on a slider usually. And that's interesting. I've never seen that pattern where you want to do this function, n times. So you're going to iterate, which creates a lazy sequence of it happening one time, and then two times, and then three times, and then four times. I've never seen that. I normally would do something like that in a loop or in a reduce. But that's interesting, and you might want to abstract this by making this into its own function. This nth iterate thing, and it would take a function and the value and the number of times. just to make that, a little bit clearer. And it would be something like end times or something. Cool. Okay, so core looks fine to me. This is the kind of code where, you have to do 100 things. So just write 100 lines, each line doing a thing. Like that, to me, I don't know if there's any other way to do that. Same with pulling out all these args. These things get messy. And I don't think any language has a better way of dealing with this kind of thing, especially this user interface stuff, like all your command line arguments. There's just a lot of stuff to pull apart and deal with. Again, if you wanted to clean this up, you might want to make this a function and this a function, and give it a good name, makes it a little clearer. But I think this is fine. Okay, this is the editor namespace. Right, so this is where I went through these. They're actually very nice. I like how short each thing is. Your text describing it is always longer than the code, which is pretty cool. You define a lot of the editor operations in here, which is nice. And I guess this is where I would start to think oh, this is where I define all of my stuff in Emacs, right? Like all those editor commands that I'm used to. Very cool. And I can also imagine that this is what has happened is that you've been adding these commands, and then where you feel like, oh, I need something back in my slider, you've added it, which is just fine. It's usually how things go. But I feel like at this point, and especially if you're asking for advice, at this point, you have a really good understanding of slider and everything it needs to do. So this is where I say do it now before it's too late. Really figure out what is your core abstraction. What are the operations that define this, that everything else can be defined in terms of. And yeah, that's one of the things that has really helped clarify my code. Just really, really dig in. And it's going to be experimental. You're going to have to see do I really want it to be a monoid where I'm inserting another slider? Does that help? Because it should help. It should be clear, oh, if I define it this way, then this function becomes even easier to write, and it's in terms of other things that I've already seen. So that's my main recommendation is revisit slider. Think about whether you can make it have fewer operations that actually reference the structure of it. And like I said, I think there's going to be the three things. There's the things dealing with marks, the things that just move the point, and then things for inserting and removing text. But really, the fewer operations, the better. If all you have is move left, move right, other things can be defined in terms of that really clearly. And then, of course, there's all the accessors, how big is this buffer? Where is my point? What are my marks? Those kinds of things. Those, you need them, but you want to abstract them. You don't want any other namespace to have to use your structure. Cool. Well, if you have any questions, please let me know. I would love to answer them. Also, I hope to see you in Prague. I think that'd be really cool. And we can talk more about it there. Awesome. And everyone else who's watching, come to Lambda Up. It's next week, and it is going to be a great time, and we should hang out. So say hi when you see me. All right. Bye.